Before this bridge could become normal, it became a warning. A newly constructed span between Tehran and Karaj was bombed. 8 people were reported dead, 95 wounded, and the destruction was pushed into public view like it was supposed to teach Iran a lesson. And this was not some forgettable strip of concrete on the edge of a battlefield. The B1 bridge stretched 1,050 meters on 136-meter high columns and had not even properly entered daily life yet, which is exactly why the strike feels so violent. It looks like a piece of a country's next chapter being broken before it could even open. But the line that should stop every viewer cold is this. The middle of the bridge was struck twice. Not one hit, not collateral damage, but 2 waves until the central span was forced open, with 8 dead and 95 wounded hanging over the sequence like a signature. If you want the layer beneath the headline, subscribe now. And if you're watching from Iran, Israel, the Gulf, or anywhere this war can hit your life by morning, tell me in the comments what crossed the line here. The bridge, the second wave, or the threat of what comes next. Iran-linked reporting says the bridge was struck a second time while rescue forces were already at the scene, helping people wounded in the first blast. That part remains unverified and has to stay that way. But the claim matters because the war over this bridge started immediately inside the gap between Wave 1 and Wave 2. That is where the story stops being simple. A bridge can be hit once and still be filed away as one more strike in one more war. A bridge hit in 2 waves, with bodies and rescuers possibly inside the timeline, turns into something else entirely. Not just impact, but choreography. And that is exactly why people click this title. Not for a lecture, not for a map lesson, but for the answer to one brutal question. Why was this bridge important enough to be finished off in 2 waves? And what was so urgent that the route had to be cut? Now, the title gives you the promise in 4 words that matter most. 2 waves, 8 dead, supply route severed. If even one of those pieces is weak, the whole story collapses into noise. But if they lock together, then what happened in Karaj was not random destruction. It was a deliberate attempt to break a route, alter movement, and send fear through the system at the same time. The American justification goes straight to the title's core claim. A U.S. defense official said the bridge was hit by U.S. forces to eliminate a planned military supply route sustaining Iran's ballistic missile and attack drone force. And the same reporting says the bridge was apparently hit twice, while Israel denied participating in the strike. That matters because once a bridge is described as a supply route, the strike stops sounding like spectacle and starts sounding like battlefield matter. You are no longer asking only why the span broke. You're asking what was supposed to cross it, how often, and what would happen to Iran's firepower if that movement suddenly stopped. This is where weak scripts get lost in slogans. They say one side claims military necessity and the other side claims civilian victimhood. Then they move on. But that is not enough here, because movement is the real subject of this story. Missiles move, drone parts move, fuel moves. War starts to widen when the routes themselves become targets. The coldest public assessment is that the bridge was struck to disrupt Iran's ability to transfer missiles to Western Iran. And once you add the missile geometry behind that, the logic gets sharper. Systems like Hajj Qasem at 1,400 kilometers, Fatah at 1,400 kilometers, and Khaybar Shikan at 1,450 kilometers matter far more when launch position shifts west. That is how supply route severed becomes more than title language. If Western launch options are under pressure, then a corridor linking Tehran to Karaj is not just transport, it is part of a firing chain. Break that chain and you do not just destroy a structure, you steal time, distance, and options from the side that depends on it. Now the 2-wave structure starts to look different too. The second strike is no longer only about damage, it can also be read as certainty. Not just hit the bridge, but make sure the route is truly broken. Not just frighten, but sever. That is why the word lands so hard. It implies interruption at the level war planners actually care about. Another account sharpened the same point. The strike was intended to cut off routes bringing drone parts and missiles to Iranian firing units targeting US and Israeli forces. So the pro-strike argument is remarkably consistent. This was sold not as punishment for punishment's sake, but as a route to kill aimed at the launch chain itself. But here is where the story gets much darker than the official lines. Even if every word of that military case is true, the image chosen for the world was still a giant bridge near Tehran, ripped open in public. That means the target was doing two jobs at once: interrupting movement and broadcasting vulnerability. That second job matters more than people think, because a missile truck can burn and vanish into military reporting. A bridge cannot. A bridge is shared space. It is a symbol of normal life. It is the kind of structure civilians subconsciously treat as part of the permanent landscape. When that gets split open, the audience does not just see a military action, they see the shrinking of what still feels untouchable. And that is why the bridge story exploded so hard. Not because viewers are obsessed with engineering, but because they instantly understood the emotional logic of the target. This was a route, yes, but it was also a message that visible infrastructure near Tehran can now be taken apart and publicly celebrated. Iran's foreign minister answered with the line Washington most needed to block: striking civilian structures, including unfinished bridges, will not compel Iranians to surrender. That is not just outrage. It is a direct attempt to recode the target itself. Because if the bridge is accepted as civilian infrastructure, then the strike looks less like interdiction and more like coercion, with civilian dead in the frame. This is the information war layer people come here for. Washington needs the bridge to live in the military category. Tehran needs it to live in the civilian category, because the category decides everything: legality, sympathy, deterrence, retaliation, and how future strikes on infrastructure will be sold. What does the evidence actually support? It supports that the route could plausibly matter to missile movement. It supports that the bridge was huge, new, symbolically loaded, and physically severed. It supports that 8 dead and 95 wounded became the dominant toll through Iranian official channels. What it does not publicly prove is whether active missile components were crossing that span when it was hit. That gap should not make you relax. It should make you more alert. Because if the military case is accurate, the strike marks a serious expansion into deep logistics hunting near Tehran. And if the military case is exaggerated, then the event reveals something even harsher: that infrastructure with public emotional weight is now useful precisely because destroying it terrifies people faster than a technical military strike ever could. Either way, the same pressure survives. The B-1 strike says this war can now justify hitting what connects a country, not only what shoots for it. And then came the line that made the bridge feel less like an isolated event and more like the first visible rung on a larger ladder. Trump threatened to hit each and every one of Iran's electric generating plants very hard, and probably simultaneously if no deal is reached. That means the bridge does not sit alone in the story. It sits next to a public threat against the grid, which turns the B-1 strike into precedent, not closure. That is the moment to the real shape of escalation appears. First the bridge, then the power, then whatever else can be framed as dual-use, strategic, or pressure-worthy. Once the latter starts forming in public, every strike below it changes, meaning the bridge is no longer just one attack. It becomes the proof that the threshold has already moved. And that is what should mess with the viewer's head most. Not only that B-1 was broken, but that its destruction can now be used to normalize what comes next. When a war starts testing how much infrastructure can be pulled inside the target set, the real damage is not just local, it spreads through expectation. That is why breaking belongs in the title. Not because a bridge blew up and everyone got excited for 6 hours, because a line may have shifted in real time from attacking the weapons of a country to pressuring the systems that keep the country stitched together. Iranian media then answered by publishing a regional bridge list that included Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmad al-Sabah Sea Bridge, King Fahd Causeway, Sheikh Zayed Bridge, Sheikh Khalifa Bridge, King Hussein Bridge, Damia Bridge, and Abdun Bridge. That is not random anger, it is mirror doctrine. If bridges are now fair game, then everyone's bridges can be imagined inside the next retaliatory map. That response widens the blast radius instantly. Karaj stops being a local strike and becomes a template. The war is no longer only saying, we can hit your assets. It is saying, we can hit what holds your movement together. And so can you. That is a different kind of fear. People expect barracks, depots, and launchers to be at risk. They do not think of public connectors the same way. Bridges feel civilian even when planners see them as dual use. That gap between public perception and military logic is exactly why the target is so powerful. And that brings us back to the human anchor inside this story. Between Wave 1 and Wave 2, this was not a strategic diagram. It was a real place with people in it. A real site where panic entered first and interpretation came later. The title works because the audience feels that human reality before they sought the military logic around it. This is also why the second wave claim is so explosive even without full confirmation. The allegation alone drags the strike from hard power into moral theater. It makes the audience ask not just what the bridge was carrying, but who was standing there when the route was finished off. That is what gives this story real YouTube retention. The facts are not static. They keep getting worse the deeper you go. First the blast, then the 2 waves, then the 8 dead, then the route severing claim, then the grid threat, then the regional bridge list. Every layer says the war is bigger than it looked 30 seconds earlier. And there is still another layer outside Karaj that explains why one bridge can shake so much more than one city. While the bridge story dominated headlines, around 40 countries were already discussing how to restore freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. That matters because the war is now fighting over movement at every scale at once. Not only what can move across Iran, but what can move through the waterway, carrying a massive share of the world's energy. Now the pattern is impossible to miss. Roads, bridges, launch corridors, shipping lanes, power lines. This war is moving toward a contest over circulation. The side that can interrupt movement without collapsing, the first gains leverage far beyond the immediate military damage of any one strike. That is why the B1 bridge matters, even to people who could not find Karaj on a map before this week. It sits at the intersection of a much larger strategic idea of pressure a country by limiting what can flow through it, out of it, and around it. And once that idea takes hold, every future target starts to look different. A bridge is not just a bridge. A refinery is not just a refinery. A power plant is not just a power plant. Each one becomes a switch in a bigger system of compulsion. The markets understood that faster than many analysts did. Markets do not care about rhetoric until rhetoric points at real choke points. On the same day, Brent crude futures jumped by $7.87, ending 7.78% higher at $109.03 a barrel. That is the financial translation of what happened in Karaj. The fear that this war is sliding away from isolated strikes and into attacks and threats against the arteries that keep energy, trade, and state capacity moving. And that is why the bridge story should not be read as dramatic footage plus commentary. It should be read as a warning that route warfare is spreading upward from tactical movement to strategic pressure. The world is reacting not only to rubble, but to doctrine. So now we can answer the central question without hiding behind soft language. Was this really a supply route strike, or was it a message disguised as one? If the supply route claim is true, then the strike was a deliberate effort to choke Iran's missile war by breaking the corridor that helped sustain it. That means the campaign has moved into a deeper, more disciplined phase, where the target is not only what Iran fires, but how Iran keeps firing. If the supply route claim is false or overstated, then the event reveals something even more dangerous. It means a giant, emotionally legible, civilian-facing structure was still judged worth destroying in public because the psychological value of the image was part of the weapon. That would mean the strike was not only about battlefield effect, it was about teaching a population what is now vulnerable. Either way, one conclusion survives every version of the story. The B1 bridge was not hit because it was merely standing there. It was hit because breaking it could alter flow, fear, and future choices all at once. That is why the title lands breaking, because the threshold may have shifted in real time. 2 waves because one blast was not enough. 8 dead because this was paid for in bodies, not abstractions. Supply route severed because the whole point was not just destruction, but interruption. And once interruption becomes the logic, the war changes character. It stops being only about explosive force. It becomes about who can keep systems open and who can force them closed. So remember the human picture underneath all the strategy. Between the first strike and the second, somebody was still trying to understand what had just happened. Somebody was still near the bridge. Somebody was moving toward the wounded or away from the smoke. Then the sequence kept going. That is the hardest truth in this entire story. The route was not severed in theory. It was severed in time, in public, and with enough violence that the image now does a part of the war's work by itself. And that is what should stay with the viewer after the last frame fades. Not just that a bridge in Karaj was blasted, but that a country was told, in the language of broken infrastructure, that what connects it can now be hunted too. Stay with this channel. We follow the point where the strike ends and the real meaning begins.